So we've been looking at where is God in the midst of suffering. And we've been looking at the answers to that question through the life of the lens of Joseph. And we find him, as we left off in our study of Joseph, that he is in prison. At the end of Genesis 39, remember that we have Joseph who is faithfully serving God, and he is faithfully serving Potiphar and in his household. And yet, in the process of faithfully serving God and serving Potiphar, we are told that he was having Potiphar's wife day after day, tempting him and calling for him to come to her. And in the process of that, in his constant rejection of that, she then instead then screams that there was a sexual assault, and he is now thrown in prison. And one of the things that we noted in chapter 39 of Genesis was 4 times we were told that God was with Joseph. 4 times, the beginning and at the end. And all that Joseph is going through, even though it did not look like it, God was with him. And that moves us now to this next scene, because what I think would be challenging for us, if you put yourself in the shoes of Joseph, is now here you are in prison. You are innocent. You have done nothing wrong. You've remained faithful to God. You've held to your integrity and your righteousness. And for all of your good works and for all of your trusting in God, here now you find yourself in prison. And I wish there would be a moment to interview Joseph at this scene, and I would ask him, so what do you think about those dreams you had where you were told that your whole family was going to bow down to you, and here you are in prison in Egypt? How is that looking right now? Does that look like that's going to happen? Does it really seem like God's word and promises and visions and dreams that he's given to Joseph at this point, does it look very promising that things are going to be fulfilled? And I think it's important to think about that, because this will help us as we think about, can Joseph have any hope for his life considering where he is in this moment? You would have to imagine this would be one of your most hopeless situations. You're in a prison. You're there for the rest of your life. You have no hope of getting out, and you don't know anybody that's going to somehow get you out of there. You're just there left to rot. And that's where we are as chapter 40 opens. Chapter 40 opens that sometime after this, not told an amount of time that he's been sitting here in prison, but sometime after this, while Joseph is in this prison, we are told there in verse 1 that the cupbearer for the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. You know, if you were watching a movie, we'd probably go, oh, what a coincidence this is, that it just so happens that these 2 men are put in the very place where Joseph is also in prison. Verse 4, the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in custody. So here is Joseph, he's in prison. Remember that even though he's been in prison, chapter 39 reminds us that he has been elevated within the prison, and he is going about doing work for the captain of the guard. And it so happens that verse 4 tells us that 2 of the people that he is going to be serving and working in the prison is for these 2 men who have been put into this prison, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, formerly in Pharaoh's service. In verse 5, we're told that one night they both had a dream, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with their own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled, and so he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody of his master's house, why are your faces downcast? And we have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Let's talk about this scene for a minute because I find Joseph here to be absolutely fascinating. So here you are, you're doing your job, you're carrying out your work, you're doing your day-to-day activities, and one day two of the prisoners seem to be downcast. Something's wrong. And I want you to think about that he even cares that these two guys are having a bad day for some reason. And I think my snarky reaction would be, oh, you two think you're having a bad day. Let me tell you my life story. I'll cheer you up in a heartbeat. Let me just tell you about my brothers and how they threw me in a pit, tried to kill me, but sold me instead. And here I tried to bounce back up on my feet, and I'm working in Potiphar's house, and then she lied about it. He wants to know how they're doing. And so he then says, so what's going on? And I want you to think about when they say, we've had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. You don't have Joseph go, whoa, dreams, that's a nasty bit. I've had my share of that. Boy, I had some dreams and that got me in a world of trouble and my brothers hate me because of the dreams that I had. Don't tell me any dreams because, man, that's why I'm down here in this mess. No. Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. I want you to notice that in the face of everything that he's been going through in his life, he still perceives himself as an instrument for God's use. Even as, I don't know how much worse things could get for this man at this point, but even as bad as those things are, he still sees himself as an instrument in the hands of God. And what I think is particularly something to think about is, I read this and I go, well, since when was Joseph a dream interpreter? I think this is interesting that Joseph is able to say, I know that God can give me the meaning of the dreams. He doesn't say, I'm pretty good at dreams. Let me take a crack at it. Tell me your story. I might be able to come up with something pretty good for you. He says, God is the one who explains dreams. You tell me the dream, and God is going to explain it. I can give you the interpretation. I can give you the answer. And so again, Joseph seems to have an awareness and understanding that God is with him and that God is going to stay with him and is working through him, and thus he is doing this work in the prison in spite of all the things that he has endured. And thus he says, why don't you tell them to me? And in verse 9, I want you to notice that the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, and in the dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. That's the dream that he has. Joseph says, let me tell you what that means. The 3 branches, verse 12, are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head and restore your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. But please now notice verse 14. Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness. I would do a parenthesis for you right here. That Hebrew word is the one that's commonly translated steadfast love, that hesed of God. Do me a covenant, steadfast, loyal love for me, a kindness to me, to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. Why should he get out of the house? Well, verse 15. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into this pit. And so he says, here's what's going to happen. In 3 days, you're going to be back right before Pharaoh again. You're going to be the cupbearer again. You're going to be handing him the cups just like you used to in the past. Complete restoration is going to come to you. And when you are there, please tell him about me. Please tell him my circumstance. Please tell him that I am down here for no good reason. I am innocent. I've been sold off. I haven't done anything wrong. Well, you can imagine there's the baker sitting there hearing that great interpretation. That sounds like a great dream, great answer. Loved all that. So verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, you can imagine he was sitting back going, okay, let's see how this goes with this Joseph guy and interpreting dreams. That's a great answer. 3-day restoration. Sounds good. And so he says, here's my dream. I also had a dream, and there were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket, there was all sorts of baked food for the Pharaoh, but the birds were eating out of it on the basket of my head. And I want you to listen to how Joseph begins the same interpretation answer. Verse 18, and Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. 1, to the cupbearer, going to lift your head in 3 days and restore you to your position. To the baker, in 3 days, your head's going to be lifted from your body, and you are going to hang there, and that's going to be the end of you. And I want you to notice that on verse 20, it says, on the 3rd day, everything that Joseph said was fulfilled. On the 3rd day, which is Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position and placed the cup in the hand of Pharaoh, and he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted them. You can imagine how exciting that would be. That it all came to pass exactly as God had told Joseph, and is just as much as Joseph has told these 2 men. And what must be so devastating are the words of verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. You know, I think about what that would have felt like if you could imagine yourself being in the prison and you have told these 2 men the interpretation of their dreams, and you have told the cupbearer, you're going to be back in by. How hopeful are you? You know, as day 1 goes by that the cupbearer's back, you're thinking, okay, right? Any day now, the news is going to come down to get me out of here. Any day now, he's going to tell him, and maybe it's going to take a minute or 2. Maybe it's going to take a day or 2. Maybe we got to process some paperwork, maybe some government red tape. But surely any day now, I'm going to be getting out of here, right? And you can just imagine a day and 2 days and 3 days. And I just want you to think about, and then a week goes by, and then 2 weeks goes by, and now it's a month, and now it's 2 months, and 3 months, and 4 months. And I just want to know, at what point do you begin to realize your hope is fading away? 5 months, 6 months, 7 months. A year goes by, a year and a month, a year and a half. Chapter 41, verse 1, 2 whole years go by. You would have to think at that point, you figure, well, it's not going to happen. He clearly did not care, or he did not remember, but you begged him to show you steadfast kindness and care and tell the Pharaoh about me. He hasn't done it. And I just want you to have a sense of how depressing, how you would just feel your one last chance of getting out of here has probably seemed to have slipped through your fingers. And I want you to notice in chapter 41 and verse 1 that we're told after 2 whole years, Pharaoh starts having dreams. Pharaoh has a dream, and we're told in verse 2 that he sees 7 cows that are plump and attractive, and they are eating the grass. And then there are 7 other cows that are ugly and thin that also come up out of the Nile. But here's the real picture, is the 7 ugly, thin cows eat the 7 plump, attractive cows. And that's the end of the dream. That's a little strange. But back to sleep in verse 5. And it says there he gets a different dream. This time 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And then after that there's these 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. And the 10 ears swallowed up the 7 plump ears. And that's the end of that dream. And I want you to notice that we're told in verse 8, in the morning Pharaoh is troubled. He sends for all of the magicians of Egypt and all of his wise men. And Pharaoh tells them the dreams, but there was none who could interpret the dreams. And we're not surprised by that because Joseph made a very important truth. Is not God the interpreter of dreams? Interpretations belong to God, and so no one is able to come up with an answer to this dream. And verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. It's like you can just imagine the scene. And he tells this dream to everybody, doesn't seem to register yet, but everybody can't give him an answer to the dream, and finally the light bulb turns on. Oh yeah. Hey Pharaoh, when I was in prison, when you were mad at me, let's not remember that, but when you were mad at me 2 years ago when I was down in the prison, there was a guy down there who was able to interpret dreams. Verse 12, a young Hebrew was there, captain of the servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams for us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And when he interpreted, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So verse 14, Pharaoh, let's go get him, quickly grab him. I love the picture of verse 14. Here's realism. They have to clean Joseph up. Please listen to the words. They quickly brought him out of the pit. So last time he got brought out of the pit, he got worse, down into slavery into Egypt, remember? This time he's brought out of the pit, and they shave him, and they change his clothes, and they trot him in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh explains to Joseph, I've had a dream, verse 15, and there's no one who is able to interpret it. And I want you to listen to what Joseph says now. Notice again, doesn't say, dreams are bad business. That's what got me in this mess in the first place. But again, he says, it's not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. He will be able to explain what this is. I'm not doing this. This is clearly God. God is the one who will give the answer. And so the dream is retold from verse 15 all the way down to verse 24, the same that was told to us earlier in the chapter. In verse 25, Joseph now reveals what God has said. In fact, he makes sure that Pharaoh knows that in verse 25. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. And the dreams mean 7 years of abundance are coming, but understand this, that the 7 years of famine that are going to come after that are going to completely swallow up and consume any abundance that we had in the first 7 years. And the fact that there are 2 dreams is to indicate that it's going to happen soon. And then I want you to notice that Joseph then gives some directions about all of this. He says in verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming to store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities. And let them keep it, and that food will be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are about to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through this famine. Not only does he give them the interpretation, but says, here's your plan. Here's the best course. You need to start storing up now. Take 1/5 from the land right now for these 7 years and hold it. And put somebody in charge who is wise and discerning, who can watch over that so that when the 7 years of awful time and famine come, we're ready and we will not then succumb to this famine. Verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom there is the Spirit of God? I just want you to visualize what Pharaoh's court must have looked like. They just trotted this guy out of prison, and Pharaoh goes, there's nobody better than him. This man who has been down there in prison all this time, he has the Spirit of God. There's nobody wiser. We're going to put him in charge. Verse 38, verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. You are my number two. You've become prime minister. You are in charge of everything. And there's only one person greater than you, Joseph, now, and that's me. And you are going to take care of these affairs, and you are going to run all of this. Not only that, verse 41, see, I've set you over the whole land of Egypt. Verse 42 gives them the signet ring from his hand, puts it on Joseph's hand, clothes him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. This is now the third time that he's been elevated back in again. We start home and we go down to Potiphar. Now we're in Pharaoh's court. We keep getting robes on, robes taken away, robes back on again. Robes are placed upon him now. He's placed in second in command. Verse 43, riding in a chariot. Everybody in Egypt is to bow the knee. And moreover, verse 44, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt. This is not, Joseph with just like a placard, second in command. This is, everybody's got to listen. Nobody's moving without you. Whatever you say goes. You are in charge. You are taking care of all the administrative concerns of this country. And I want you to notice a very important ending to where we're going to stop for tonight is in verse 46. And it says there that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This all started with Joseph at 17 years old at home. 13 years have gone by. And after 13 years, at age 30, now he enters into the service of Pharaoh. I want us to think about how many times Joseph would have had the opportunity to quit on God. I want you to think about, for all the different circumstances that Joseph faced, how many times could Joseph give up on God and his promises? We can start with when the brothers hated him. He could have been tempted to give up on God. Or how about when they sold him into slavery, to be tempted to give up on God and his promises? Or when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife day after day after day after day. He could have given up on God and his promises. Or when he was falsely accused and sent into prison, he could have given up on God and given up on those promises. Or how about when he is forgotten by the cupbearer and 2 more years go by? It'd be so easy to throw in the towel and say, where is God in all of this? God's not going to keep his word. He's not going to fulfill his promises. I give up on God. And I want you to see right here, if Joseph had given up, he would have been missing out on what God was preparing. If Joseph had given up at any point in 13 years that went by in his life, he would have been missing out. And now here's what I really want you to think about. Who knew that this is what God was going to do in Joseph's life? Who knew that his rise was going to be that kind of rise? Number 2 in all of Egypt. The first big point I want us to observe is that the turn that God had in mind can be just around the corner. It is sometimes so difficult for us because so much time goes by and we finally, with all the time we go, I'm just going to give up. I'm not going to keep going. I'm not going to stay faithful. I'm not going to stay with God. He's taking too long. I might as well quit. I might as well give all of this up. We are tempted to give up after 13 days. For me, I'm tempted to give up after 13 minutes. 13 years. Who doesn't want to give up after that? And I want us to hear that God could make the turn before you know it. The turn can be just around the corner. You don't know if the turn is today. You don't know if the turn is tomorrow. You don't know if the turn is next week. You don't know if the turn is next year. You don't know if the turn is in 13 years. Will you stay faithful and wait for the turn? That's what Joseph was challenged to do, is that he had to wait for the turn. And that's hard for us. As much as we like to sing songs about in his time, God makes all things beautiful in his time, and he was do things according to his plan and his will and not ours. But the reality is, I try to make God's plan my plan, right? His time has to be my time. That's how we want to operate. It's been a week, it's been a month, it's time. And if you don't do it on my time frame, you must not be doing it. And God always makes his people wait. This is part of the walk of faith. We don't have time to think about everybody, but think about, in your own mind quickly, how many people had to wait for God's promises? Abraham's one of my favorite. They look at life and go, we're too old for God's promises. We're going to have to take matters into our own hands. There's no way that God can keep his promises. We're too old. God goes, no. You got to wait for the turn. You got to wait for the turn. You have to wait for God to accomplish his work. And I think we see some great pictures of that. But let me use Isaiah chapter 40. Listen to what God says through Isaiah. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. Okay, what's the big point of knowing that? He does not faint or grow weary, and his understanding's unsearchable. Just key point right here. Here we are waiting, right? And we're just, time's going on. Is God getting tired in the wait? No. He's not up there going, man, this is exhausting. I just, goodness, how much longer? No. He doesn't faint. He doesn't grow tired. He's not weary. He's not up there running the universe and going, I think I need to take a nap. I'll let it spin for a while. I'll catch up to you in 13 years. He doesn't get tired. Well, what's the point that he's getting at? Well, he gives power to the faint. And to him who has no might, he increases strength. That even the youth will faint and be weary, young men shall fall exhausted. Huge point. This needs to be like a whole sermon unto itself. Don't have time. This is a really important point, though. You relying on you're going to be tired. He says even the young men are going to get tired and exhausted and faint. You try to get through this life, you doing you, not going to work. You're going to be exhausted. Only God doesn't grow weary. We get tired. We're trying to, we're in control. We're in charge. We got it all figured out. God makes sure to mess things up so that we realize that ain't true. He's in charge. We're not. And we grow tired and faint. So what's the solution? He's going to give power to the faint, and he's going to give strength to those who don't have might. How is he going to do it? They who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I want you to see Joseph's life is that prophecy right there. He's waiting for God. And as he waits, he's not complaining. He's not bitter. He's not kicking the can all my life and, I don't care about your dreams and who cares about you prisoners. He is serving God, and he's an instrument in God's hand as he waits for God to work. And I think it's a beautiful picture of how we have to wait for the turn. We have to wait for God's timing. We have to wait for God's understanding. I read this and I go, I want it to be on my understanding. I want it to be on my time. His understanding's unsearchable. In other words, he knows what he's doing. We think we do. And how silly it is that we think our wisdom and our understanding's unsearchable when not only do we not know the future, we don't even know what's going on with everybody else in the universe. You understand, God sees the beginning from the end, and he sees all people at all times and all that's going on. But we act like we know what's best. And I'm not waiting on God. I know what needs to happen in my life right here, right now. He needs to do it, and if he doesn't do what I want to do, I'm going to quit. I want you to hear through the life of Joseph, don't quit. Wait. Wait for the turn. Friends, I am heartbroken at how many people quit on God and quit on life because they don't believe the turn is coming. We give up on God because we just don't think God cares, that God can change things, that God can cause a reversal, that God has something in mind, that there's not great things that God has in store for us, that eternity is worth any amount of suffering that we might experience now. We just don't believe it, and we quit on God. They feel like they can't wait any longer for the turn. We need to wait for the turn. And I want to emphasize one other aspect about this turn that I think is critically important to our understanding of suffering. Joseph's rise did not mean he went back home. Joseph's restoration did not mean he went back to his family. The turn didn't mean going back to the way things were. And that can be a struggle for us. It is hard for us to wrestle with this because often in our trials, what we are asking God to do is to return life to the way it was. Make it the way it was. Just erase all this, run it backward, put it back the way it was. And I want us to see that that's not what God does. The turn doesn't mean return. And the reason why that's important is that we can miss the turn that God is accomplishing in our lives because we are so focused on it going back to the way it was. And we don't see where God's going in our lives and where he's trying to take us because we just want to go back. Just make it what it was back there. And if that's all Joseph was looking for was, I just want to go home, he would have missed all this. He didn't understand that his rise was not about going home and being with his brothers again. His rise was going to be your number 2 next to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's what God had in store for you. That's where God was taking things in all of this. Not to bring you back home, but instead he had something greater. And the turn means that God can lift us out of the pit and give us the strength that we need to move forward. I know for me, I think about in my early years, I spent way too much time being angry that life did not return, because that's what I wanted. I wanted, for much of my early years, I wanted a return. Put it back to the way it was. I want family to go back to the way it was. I want life to go back to the way it was. And that's not the turn God had in store. It's not about return, but about the turn that God can have in your life. And in that process, I was completely missing what God was trying to do in moving me in the direction I needed to go. And we would miss it like Joseph would have if we were not looking for the great turn. Final point. Did you see Jesus in this story? Jesus looks rejected and forsaken. We looked at this morning. He's cast off by God. If God desires you, he wouldn't let you go through anything like this. And I want you to hear the words that at age 30, he's put into service. Isn't that amazing that here is Joseph standing as this foreshadowing of the rescuer of the world. And here Joseph is going to be the rescuer of the world in preparation for this great famine to come. And at age 30, he enters into service of the king, and the turn was around the corner, and the Father would glorify the Son by raising him from the dead and putting him at the right hand of God. It's amazing to think about how God would exalt his suffering servant into kingship to be able to save the world, just as Joseph depicted in a foreshadowing of his life. The bars of the pit were opened, and he was raised from the pit, and the turn was just around the corner. 3 days, and the turn happened. Wait for the turn and look for what God is going to do to put you into his service. Let's go to God in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, your hand and your power in the life of Joseph is absolutely amazing. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to take encouragement from the life of Joseph, that in spite of all that he endured, and in spite of how it would be so difficult to have hope and understanding about what you were doing in his life, he waited for you. And Lord, I pray that you would give us that same faith. Give us the faith to wait for you and to trust in your wisdom. For you have promised that you will give us strength and you will give us the help we need through our difficulty if we will look to you and wait for you. Lord, give us the strength. Whether the turn takes a week, takes a year, takes 13 years, or takes a whole lifetime, Lord, we know the turn of eternity is going to be a glorious turn, and we long to be with you. Lord, help us to be faithful. Help us to be steadfast. Lord, give us the strength to not give up, and give us the strength to wait for you. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll sing invitation song. We invite you to come to Jesus this evening, to turn away from your sin and see that God has the power to work in your life, to work a change that you would never believe. And the greatest change that he can work for you, and the most important change that he can work for you, is to set you free from your sin and make you a child of his, so that you have the hope of eternity forever with him. What a greater promise could there be? Never mind the glory of him walking with you every day while you live, but to know you will be with him as a child for all eternity. Why would you say no? Won't you come to him now while we stand and while we sing?